Imagine an aquarium so well designed that the fish inside it believe they're in the ocean. Artificial currents simulate the tides. Temperature is perfectly controlled. Food appears at just the right moments, and even small predators are occasionally introduced to maintain the illusion of danger and the feeling that they're truly alive and free. The fish swim vigorously, compete for territory, form schools, reproduce, and live their lives with absolute conviction that they are free. When some more observant fish begin to suspect that something isn't right, that the boundaries of their world always seem the same, that certain currents repeat in very precise patterns, they petition the aquarium managers. They ask for more space to swim, more variety in food, greater transparency about how the currents work. They ask for freedom, but they don't realize they're asking for this freedom from those who designed and maintain the very system of control. Have you ever wondered if our current situation isn't exactly this? We live protesting on social media for more algorithmic transparency, asking the same companies that monitor us to be more ethical with our data, demanding that governments better regulate the internet while obediently navigating within the same apps every day. We march in the streets asking for changes to the system, but using the transportation, communication, and organization systems that this same system provides us. We vote for politicians who promise to liberate us, but within electoral structures that were designed to keep everything functioning exactly as it always has. There's something profoundly paradoxical and almost tragicomic about asking for freedom from the architects of our prison. And most disturbing of all is that perhaps they're not even malicious. Perhaps they're just slightly larger fish in the same aquarium, convinced they're in the ocean, managing a system that none of us really understand or control. To understand how we arrived at this extraordinary situation, we need to go back in time and examine how the very notion of freedom has been constantly redefined throughout human history. For millennia, freedom was something simple and direct. A slave knew he wasn't free because there were visible chains on his wrists and a clearly identifiable master who commanded his life. A medieval serf knew his freedom was limited because there was a feudal lord who controlled his lands and dictated his obligations. Oppression had a face, a name, an address. Resistance knew whom to fight. But something fascinating happened as societies became more complex. Control systems became more sophisticated, more subtle, more diffuse. Freedom ceased to be a matter of breaking physical chains and became a matter of navigating invisible labyrinths. Real power hid behind layers and layers of mediation, seemingly neutral institutions, seemingly democratic processes, seemingly free choices. Consider the evolution of human labor. The ancient slave knew he worked under coercion. The modern worker believes he works by his own choice. He signs a contract, negotiates his salary, can theoretically leave whenever he wants. He feels free. But look more closely. He needs to work to survive. The available work options are determined by economic forces completely outside his control. His time is rigorously monitored. His productivity is constantly measured. His communications are supervised. And even his thoughts during work are shaped by corporate training and organizational cultures. He's free to choose between different forms of subordination. but subordination itself is not in question. This is the genius of modern control systems. They don't eliminate freedom, they channel it. They don't prohibit choices, they carefully limit the universe of available choices. They don't tell us what to think, they influence how we think. And the most brilliant piece of this entire mechanism is that they manage to convince us that any limitation we experience can be overcome by working within the very system that creates these limitations. We see this everywhere once we start looking. The environmental movement asks the same corporations that cause environmental degradation to become more sustainable. Privacy activists ask technology companies to respect our data more. Democracy advocates ask politicians to make the political system more representative. In each case, we're essentially asking the problem to solve itself. But why do we do this? Why can't we imagine solutions that come from outside the systems we want to transform? The answer lies in how our own capacity to imagine alternatives has been systematically limited. We live in an age of information abundance, but radical imagination scarcity. We have access to more data about how the world works than any previous generation, but less capacity to visualize how the world could function fundamentally differently. This is not accidental. Modern educational systems are extremely effective at teaching people to solve problems within existing frameworks, but very poor at teaching people to question the frameworks themselves. We learn to optimize, not to reimagine. We learn to reform, not to revolutionize. We learn to ask for changes, not to create changes. Digital technology has dramatically intensified this phenomenon. The algorithms that govern our online experiences are not just neutral recommendation systems, they are behavioral shaping systems that gradually direct us toward more predictable versions of ourselves. Every click we make, every video we watch, every product we buy feeds increasingly precise models of who we are and what we want. And these models are then used to present to us exactly the kind of content, products, and opportunities that confirm and reinforce these patterns. The result is that we become prisoners of our own preferences. The system knows us so well that it can predict what we'll do before we even decide to do it. And because it delivers exactly what we apparently want, we experience this as freedom, as personalization, as service. But in reality, our margin for maneuver is constantly shrinking. We're becoming more predictable, more controllable, more easily manipulable, even while feeling more unique and autonomous than ever. The most insidious aspect of all this is how resistance movements themselves are incorporated into the system. Any form of protest or dissidence that gains momentum quickly becomes a new market category. The counterculture of the 60s became a brand. The punk movement became a fashion aesthetic. Environmental resistance became green consumerism. Criticism of capitalism became conscious capitalism. Even privacy and security became products that can be bought and sold. This creates a surreal situation where the more intensely we protest against the system, the more energy we provide for it to adapt and strengthen itself. Every liberation movement eventually becomes a new tool of control. Every criticism becomes a new marketing strategy. Every alternative becomes a new option within the carefully curated menu of choices. Take the example of social media and digital democracy. Initially, the internet was seen as a fundamentally democratizing force. It would give voice to the voiceless, allow people to organize without intermediaries, create direct forms of political participation. And indeed, we saw all of this happen. But we also saw something unexpected. These same tools became the most powerful instruments of political manipulation and social control that humanity has ever known. The platforms that promised to connect people for common causes became polarization machines that divide communities. The algorithms that promised to personalize information became customized disinformation systems. The tools that promised to empower individuals became mass surveillance mechanisms. And most disturbing, all of this happened not through some centralized evil plan, but through the internal logic of these technologies themselves. Technology companies didn't deliberately plan to create echo chambers that fuel political extremism. They simply optimized for engagement and discovered that controversial content keeps people connected longer. They didn't deliberately plan to undermine democracy. They simply created systems that allow anyone with sufficient resources to target messages precisely to specific audiences, and discovered that this can be used both to sell products and to sell ideologies. This is the central paradox of our era. The systems we create to liberate ourselves automatically become systems that control us, not because someone deliberately perverted their original function, but because freedom and control in sufficiently complex contexts can be functionally indistinguishable. When you have the freedom to choose between 1,000 television channels, but all of them are financed by the same economic model that requires them to capture and maintain your attention, to sell that attention to advertisers, do you really have 1,000 choices? Or just one choice disguised in 1,000 different ways? When you have the freedom to vote between different candidates, but all of them operate within the same economic and political system that drastically limits what any of them can actually do once in power, are you really choosing different directions for society? Or just different styles of managing the same fundamental direction? The question becomes even more complex when we consider that many people within these systems genuinely want to do good. The software engineer working on recommendation algorithms may genuinely believe he's helping people discover interesting content. The politician promoting democratic reforms may genuinely believe he's strengthening popular representation. The corporate executive implementing social responsibility policies may genuinely believe he's making capitalism more humane. But here's the problem. Individual intentions are irrelevant when it comes to sufficiently large and complex systems. A system can produce results that no one within it wants or plans. It can have its own logic that overrides the intentions of any individual participants. And it can be structured in such a way that trying to change it from within only strengthens its capacity to resist real change. Consider how many times throughout history we've seen people come to power promising to transform the system, only to discover that the system transforms them. They enter as reformers and exit as administrators. They arrive as revolutionaries and become bureaucrats. Not because they're hypocrites or venal, but because the structures within which they operate are more powerful than their individual intentions. This brings us to a deeply uncomfortable question. If we can't transform systems by working within them, and if every attempt to resist them ends up being incorporated by them, is there any real form of change? Or are we doomed to be eternally fish, asking for improved aquarium conditions from the aquarium owners? The answer, I believe, begins with a fundamental shift in how we understand the very nature of freedom. As long as we continue thinking of freedom as the ability to make choices within a set of predefined options, we'll always be trapped asking for better options from those who define those options. Real freedom may require the ability to question and transform the structures that determine which options are available in the first place. But this leads us into much more radical and uncomfortable territory. It means recognizing that many of the institutions we consider fundamental to civilized society may actually be obstacles to full human experience. It means questioning not just how power is exercised, but whether certain forms of power should exist. It means imagining forms of social organization that may be radically different from everything we know. Historically, this kind of radical questioning has happened only in moments of profound crisis, when existing systems collapsed and people were forced to imagine alternatives. But perhaps we're approaching one of these moments. Climate change, automation, artificial intelligence, growing inequality, the erosion of trust in institutions, all these converging forces may be creating conditions where traditional forms of social organization simply can no longer function. If this is true, then the near future may be a period of unprecedented social experimentation. Not the kind of experimentation that happens within existing structures, but the kind that creates completely new structures, new forms of economic organization that don't depend on infinite growth or rigid hierarchies, new forms of political organization that don't depend on centralized representation or nation states, new forms of social organization that don't depend on massified institutions or tribal identifications. But for this to happen, we need to develop capacities that our current education and culture don't teach us. We need to learn to think in systems without becoming prisoners of those thought systems. We need to learn to imagine alternatives without becoming unrealistic utopians. We need to learn to question fundamental structures without becoming destructive nihilists. I need to stop for a moment and ask you directly, which aspect of this analysis most disturbs your worldview? At what moment in your life have you already felt this sensation of asking for changes from the same forces that created the problems you want to solve? I know it can be uncomfortable to admit that perhaps we're all participating in systems that fundamentally contradict our deepest values. But here in this space, your honest reflection is welcome. Share in the comments, I feel like I'm asking for freedom from the system when. Your honesty can illuminate the path for someone who is going through the same disturbing perception that perhaps we're all trapped in something much larger and more subtle than we imagined. More fundamentally, we need to learn to distinguish between cosmetic change and structural change. Most of what our culture calls change is actually just variation within the same basic structure. New products, new brands, new politicians, new movements, but all operating according to the same fundamental logic. Real change requires alteration of that fundamental logic. But how do we do this? How can an individual person contribute to structural change when immersed in the very systems they want to transform? This may be the most important question any of us can ask. And unfortunately, there are no easy answers or ready-made formulas. Perhaps it begins with small acts of non-participation, not in the sense of completely withdrawing from society, which is impossible for most people, but in the sense of identifying specific points where we can refuse to collaborate with aspects of the system we consider most problematic. This might mean deliberately choosing not to use certain technologies, not buying from certain companies, not voting for certain types of candidates, not participating in certain forms of entertainment or consumption. More importantly, it might mean cultivating ways of thinking and being that don't depend on validation or approval from dominant systems. Developing relationships that aren't mediated by corporate platforms. Creating art that doesn't aim for commercial success. Seeking knowledge that doesn't aim for credentials or professional status. Practicing forms of spirituality or philosophy that aren't organized as institutional religions. In essence, it's about recovering aspects of human experience that have been colonized by systems of control and commodification, rediscovering what it means to be alive in ways that cannot be easily captured, measured, optimized, or monetized by dominant systems. This is not escapism or individualism. It's preparatory work. It's cultivating the internal capacities and relationships that will be necessary when opportunities for real structural change present themselves. And these opportunities will come because current systems are not sustainable in the long term. They are consuming the natural and human resources on which they depend. They are creating contradictions that they will eventually be unable to resolve within their own structures. The question is not whether these systems will change. The question is whether we'll be prepared to consciously participate in that change, or whether we'll just be passive victims of forces we don't understand. Whether we cultivate the internal capacities necessary to imagine and create real alternatives, or whether we just react to crises as they arise. And this brings us back to the aquarium metaphor with which we began. The fish in the aquarium aren't wrong to want more space, cleaner water, better food. These are legitimate desires. But as long as they direct these desires only to the aquarium managers, they'll always be limited by the structures those managers are willing or able to provide. Real transformation begins when the fish develop the capacity to question not just the conditions within the aquarium, but the very existence of the aquarium. When they begin to imagine what it would be like to live in the ocean, even though they've never experienced it. When they begin to develop the capacities that would be necessary to survive and thrive in a radically different environment. For us, this means developing capacities of thought, relationship, and action that don't depend on the systems we want to transform. It means cultivating forms of consciousness that can perceive and imagine beyond current structures. It means practicing ways of life that are intrinsically valuable, regardless of how they fit into the success metrics of dominant systems. I'm not suggesting this is easy or that there are guarantees of success. The challenges we face are systemic and global, and no individual strategy can solve them alone. But I believe developing these capacities is both necessary and possible, and that beginning this work now is better than waiting until crises become even more severe. Perhaps real freedom isn't something we can ask for or demand from anyone. Perhaps it's something we have to cultivate and practice individually and collectively until it becomes strong enough to transform the structures that currently limit its expression. Perhaps it's less a political question and more a question of human development. Less about changing the rules of the game and more about remembering that we are more than players in games created by others. If these reflections have touched something you've been feeling, but perhaps haven't found words to express, know that you are not alone. By subscribing to the channel, you'll connect with a growing community of people who share these concerns and this desire for a deeper understanding of the existential challenges of our time. Each week, we meet here to explore together the great questions that define our era and to seek not just understanding, but also wiser ways of living amid the transformations we're witnessing. This is not just a channel, but a space for dialogue and collective growth. Join us on this continuous journey. Subscribe so we can continue this essential conversation about how to live with more wisdom and authenticity in a world that often invites us to be diminished versions of ourselves. And perhaps by cultivating together these capacities for radical questioning and creative imagination, we can gradually remember that we are more than fish in any aquarium. No matter how sophisticatedly designed, we are beings capable of ocean, of open space, of possibilities we can't even fully imagine yet. The question isn't whether we deserve this freedom. The question is whether we're willing to do the internal and collective work necessary to claim and express it.